example, they're out off of Southeast Main Street. There was a body that was found in a house, okay, an abandoned house. And at this point, we're able to say that it is Catherine, okay? I'm so sorry for your loss, sir. At this time, we are investigating, and we would investigate every death the same way. We start with homicide and work our way from there, okay? What the restraining order deal? What's the deal with that?
Documentary-style narrative. In the area near Southeast Main Street, authorities discovered a body inside a residence. The victim was soon confirmed to be Kevin. The confirmation brought an abrupt end to lingering uncertainty, replacing it with grief and finality. For investigators, however, this was not simply a tragic notification. It was the first verified anchor point in a case that would quickly reveal deeper layers of violence, fear, and deception. At the center of the unfolding investigation was John Blauvelt, a 28-year-old man with a background that would later become highly relevant to the methods used in the crime. What initially appeared to be the disappearance of his wife soon transformed into a case far more complex than most local authorities had encountered. The missing woman, Katie Blauvelt, only 22 years old, was eventually found in an abandoned structure. The condition of her body was described as exceptionally brutal, and the setting surrounding her death appeared deliberately staged with dark imagery, including symbols interpreted by responders and later discussed publicly as demonic. But at the time these elements first entered the case, no one could say for certain whether they were meaningful indicators of motive or if they were deliberately planted to influence perception. That uncertainty would become one of the defining themes of the entire investigation. The question of what was real and what had been arranged to mislead. Behind the scenes, investigators would later come to believe that John carried a disturbing secret, a detail he was never able to openly acknowledge during early interviews. His ability to mask inner intent, maintain a calm surface, and guide others toward false assumptions was not accidental. Law enforcement would eventually suggest that his military training played a key role in his ability to execute violence in a calculated, controlled way, leaving behind minimal direct evidence and confusing the narrative for years. What followed was a pattern that defied what many investigators believed was logical. A young woman disappeared in broad daylight. Her last known movements seemed ordinary, documented in fragments of routine life. Yet behind that normality, a hidden mechanism was already in motion, one that would end in death and a prolonged struggle for truth. The last known hours, when routine became the last record. At approximately 2:15 p.m. on October 24, 2016, surveillance cameras captured Katie Blauvelt inside her workplace. Her shift was nearing completion. There was no visible sign of distress, urgency, or danger. She was scheduled to meet her mother at 3 p.m., and the plan appeared to be part of an ordinary day. As she left, she made contact with her mother and took a selfie. An action so normal and casual that no one could have recognized it as her final known image alive. Not long afterward, her phone transmitted its last known location. Then, without warning, Katie disappeared. 5 hours passed. By 7 p.m., she still had not returned home to meet her mother for dinner. The silence became a warning signal. Her mother and other family members repeatedly attempted to contact her. Every call went unanswered. The phone appeared unreachable, either shut off, destroyed, or moved into an area without signal. At 7:48 p.m., Katie's mother officially reported her missing. From that moment, the case transformed into an active search operation. Police began coordinating with friends and family. Community members mobilized. Leads were checked. Known locations were searched. But the structure of the timeline contained a critical gap. 5 hours in which no confirmed information existed. That empty window would become the most important and most difficult part of the case to reconstruct, and investigators would spend months attempting to fill it with facts. 10 hours passed without a reliable lead. Then at 12:33 a.m., a sudden call came in that would change the entire direction of the investigation. A friend of Katie reported that he had discovered her body inside an abandoned structure deep in a wooded area. With that call, the case shifted immediately from missing person to homicide. The discovery, a scene built to shock and mislead. Emergency responders and officers moved quickly toward an abandoned property located far enough into the woods to be concealed from casual observation. When they arrived, they noticed the setting immediately carried disturbing details. Graffiti covered parts of the structure, including symbols interpreted as occult or demonic. Whether those markings were connected to genuine ritual beliefs, random vandalism, or intentional manipulation was unknown at the time, but the imagery became inseparable from the public narrative. The man who called in the report was identified as Wayne Rower, described as a friend of Katie. He guided officers into the structure and down into the basement, where the most disturbing discovery waited. Inside, investigators found a large concrete container sealed with plywood. When the covering was removed, the sight beneath confirmed the call's grim reality. Katie's body was inside. A knife had been driven into her neck, and multiple wounds were visible across her body. Reports referenced as many as 16 separate stab injuries. There were no obvious signs that she had fought back. Her clothing was disturbed, her shirt pulled upward and her lower clothing missing, suggesting the attack was not spontaneous but deliberate, controlled, and intended to degrade as well as destroy. In homicide investigations, the first hours are critical. Investigators must build an initial hypothesis based on the most visible facts: location, injuries, victim condition, and who discovered the body. In this case, those facts pointed quickly toward the person who had brought police to the scene. From an investigative perspective, Wayne became the first natural suspect. But what detectives did not yet realize was that the scene contained elements that could function like a trap. The symbolism, the location, and the overall staging created a narrative so immediate and shocking that it pulled attention in a very specific direction. And in later analysis, authorities would question whether this was the true meaning of the scene, or a deliberate attempt to redirect suspicion. What felt like a breakthrough may have been a misdirection. The first arrest. Why early confidence can become a dangerous mistake. As forensic work progressed into the night, additional details strengthened suspicion toward Wayne. Katie's body appeared to have been dragged into the basement, indicating someone had moved her after death or during the final stage of the assault. Her phone was discovered submerged in water, suggesting an attempt to destroy digital evidence, erase location data, and eliminate communication records. From a procedural standpoint, these details did not automatically prove guilt, but they reinforced the perception of planning and concealment. Wayne was taken into custody and brought in for questioning. Investigators viewed him as a potential offender, and the interrogation strategy reflected that. They aimed to establish motive, opportunity, and contradictions in his statements. One important factor immediately shaped suspicion. Wayne and Katie had a past relationship. According to what he would later claim, they had dated before losing contact. Then, after Katie's marriage to John Blauvelt, Wayne re-entered her life again, this time in a way that deepened complexity. Wayne described a living arrangement in which he moved into Katie and John's home as a roommate for financial reasons. That arrangement alone would be unusual in many social contexts, but in investigation terms, it created a clear possibility of jealousy, emotional conflict, and interpersonal tension. As detectives searched for a motive, they found it. However, the deeper Wayne spoke, the more the story produced confusion. He described unstable dynamics between Katie and John, including arguments, jealousy, alcohol, and an escalation of tension over time. He claimed that Katie eventually moved out to live with her mother, suggesting that conflict inside the home had reached a breaking point. These statements introduced an alternative suspect profile: John Blauvelt. If Wayne's claims were true, then John could have held motive, could have displayed controlling behavior, and could have been capable of violence. And yet Wayne's account did not resolve the contradictions around his own behavior, because investigators already knew something else. Wayne's movements on the day Katie vanished did not align cleanly with innocence. The timeline problem: why Wayne remained under suspicion. Before the interrogation ever began, detectives had gathered information showing that Wayne arrived late to work on the day Katie disappeared. He also admitted to walking near the abandoned location around the same time Katie went missing. More importantly, Wayne appeared to suspect, while still at work, that Katie might be inside that building. Yet he did not contact law enforcement. Instead, he waited until later, returned to the site himself, and only then placed the call. That behavior created a deep contradiction in logic that investigators could not ignore. In missing person cases that escalate into homicide, delays in reporting or strange decision-making often become red flags, even when the person involved is not guilty. To detectives, this looked like the behavior of someone who already knew what they would find. That interpretation pushed them deeper into the initial theory, but it also meant that investigators were operating inside a narrow tunnel of belief. They had a suspect, they had a narrative, and they had a staged crime scene that supported the emotional weight of that narrative. And that is where interrogations become dangerous. Because once investigators feel they are close to solving a case, the pressure to confirm a conclusion can exceed the discipline required to remain open to new truth. The risk is not only missing the real offender, but forcing the wrong person into a confession, especially in high-stress environments where the suspect is vulnerable, confused, or psychologically worn down. In this case, the investigation approached that edge. Detectives were moving toward a point where they might attempt to force a confession from someone they believed was responsible. And if Wayne was innocent, the case was heading toward a tragedy beyond the murder itself. The possibility of the wrong man becoming the official answer, while the true killer remained free. At this stage, what remained unknown to investigators was the possibility that the crime scene had been carefully crafted to produce exactly this result. If the killer had designed the scene to frame Wayne, then every moment spent chasing Wayne was time bought for the real suspect to disappear. And in the years that followed, evidence would suggest that John Blauvelt had already begun moving far beyond the reach of local investigators, vanishing into a new life, in a new state, with a new identity, carrying the confidence of someone who believed he had escaped forever. The investigation's true threat: not just murder, but manipulation. As the case continued, investigators faced a disturbing reality. The crime was not only violent, it was strategic. The placement of symbols, the destruction of evidence, and the way suspicion naturally fell onto the discoverer of the body all suggested that the offender did not merely kill. He engineered the aftermath. When an offender creates an illusion powerful enough to redirect law enforcement, the case becomes far more than a hunt for physical evidence. It becomes a battle over perception, narrative, and psychological control. This is the stage where investigations either break open or become trapped in the wrong direction for years. And as Wayne's interrogation continued, the case moved closer to a critical turning point. One where the investigation might either expose the real offender's design or become permanently shaped by the trap laid at the beginning. The interrogation trap. How a case can turn into a false confession before it finds the truth, when the investigation believes it has the answer too early. In homicide investigations, the most dangerous moment is often not the discovery of the body, but the moment when investigators become emotionally committed to a suspect. Once that happens, evidence is no longer treated as information that must be interpreted. It becomes material that must be shaped into confirmation. This phenomenon has been documented across decades of criminal investigations. When a case begins with a dramatic discovery, an emotionally charged scene, and a perfect first suspect, the pressure to close the case quickly can quietly override the discipline needed to question assumptions. The investigation begins to drift from curiosity towards certainty. In Katie Blauvelt's case, that drift was already visible in the early hours. The person who found the body, Wayne Rohrer, was not only physically connected to the scene, but emotionally connected to the victim through a previous relationship. The crime scene itself appeared staged in a way that made him look guilty. His behavior on the day of the disappearance raised red flags, and he had returned to the location on his own before calling police. To investigators, this was more than suspicious. It looked like an explanation. But the most important question in a murder case is not who looks guilty first. It is what explanation can survive every test. And at this stage, Wayne's guilt had not yet been tested against the deeper mechanics of the timeline, the victim's movements, and the patterns of someone who had the ability to manipulate an entire investigation. The psychology of interrogation. Why pressure can replace truth. Interrogations are often imagined by the public as a simple process. Detectives ask questions, suspects lie, and eventually the truth emerges. In reality, interrogation is a psychological environment where stress, confusion, fear, and social dynamics can distort behavior, especially when the suspect is not trained, not mentally prepared, or not fully aware of how quickly words can be weaponized. The interrogation room is not neutral. It is engineered to produce a result. The suspect is isolated. Time becomes unclear. Fatigue grows. The suspect loses a sense of control. The detectives hold information, real or implied, that the suspect does not. The suspect is frequently led to believe that denial is pointless. The danger of this environment is not just that guilty people confess. The danger is that innocent people can begin to collapse under the weight of inevitability. False confessions do not require stupidity. They require human psychology under pressure. They can form through several pathways. Compliance, where the suspect says what investigators want, simply to end the stress. Internalization, where the suspect begins to doubt their own memory and accept the accusation. Coerced narrative building, where the suspect is guided into a story that fits, even if it isn't real. In Katie's case, Wayne entered an interrogation already carrying a psychological disadvantage. He believed he was being questioned as a witness. Detectives, however, were operating as if they already had their suspect. That gap in expectation, witness mindset versus suspect treatment, creates immediate vulnerability. The person being questioned may try to be helpful, fill in gaps, and speak freely, not realizing that every unclear detail can be framed as deception. Why Wayne stayed the focus? Inconsistency is easy to mistake for guilt. Wayne's statements contained contradictions, loose ends, and strange details. In investigations, this often functions like gravity. The more uncertain someone sounds, the more investigators interpret uncertainty as deception. But inconsistency is not always a sign of guilt. People under stress often misremember times. They guess. They confuse sequence. They contradict themselves not because they are lying, but because memory under emotional pressure becomes unstable. It is especially unstable in cases involving shock, grief, fear, and interrogation conditions. In Wayne's case, his social relationship with Katie created another major problem. Even truthful details could sound suspicious. A past romantic connection. A bizarre living arrangement with Katie and her husband. Claims of jealousy. Stories of conflict. Emotional history. To investigators, these are motive generators. Even if none of them are directly linked to murder, they can be interpreted as fuel for violence. In the logic of case building, motive can become a substitute for evidence. But motive alone does not kill. Evidence kills. And at this stage, there was still no forensic certainty tying Wayne to the act itself. What existed was a mixture of proximity, suspicion, and a story that the crime scene seemed to support. That is exactly what makes staged murders so effective. They provide investigators with a plausible shortcut. The staged scene problem. When the killer designs the narrative, a murder scene can tell the truth, or it can tell a story. In some crimes, the scene reflects spontaneity and chaos, a struggle, disorder, panic. In other crimes, the scene reflects deliberate messaging, a controlled placement of objects, a calculated location, and symbolic content meant to communicate something or confuse something. The abandoned structure where Katie was found contained features that immediately shaped interpretation. A remote area deep in woods. Graffiti and symbols that suggested dark ritual. A concealed concrete container. A knife embedded in the body. A lack of obvious resistance. Clothing disturbance consistent with humiliation and control. A phone submerged in water suggesting deliberate evidence destruction. Each element served two purposes at once. It horrified responders and ensured the case would be emotionally charged. It created a theory-ready suspect profile. Someone deviant, someone obsessed, someone already connected to the victim. A staged scene does not need to create a perfect frame-up. It only needs to tilt suspicion long enough for the real offender to gain time. Time is everything. If the killer can buy hours, they can destroy evidence. If they buy days, they can relocate. If they buy months, they can become invisible. And the longer investigators chase the wrong person, the more the case becomes vulnerable to collapse. The growing flaw, Wayne's story did not explain the victim's last confirmed movements. Even when investigators are convinced of a suspect, they still must solve the timeline. Timeline is the backbone of truth because time cannot be negotiated. It cannot be persuaded. It cannot be intimidated. Katie's last known routine looked ordinary. She was captured on workplace surveillance. She planned to meet her mother at a specific time. She left, took a selfie, and contacted family. Her phone pinged one final time. Then she vanished. In a clean, truthful case, Wayne's involvement would need to logically connect to these facts. Investigators would need to show how he intersected with her route, her last phone activity, and her disappearance window. But this is where the investigation began to face a problem. The crime scene suggested Wayne's guilt, but the timeline demanded deeper verification. If Wayne had killed Katie, there had to be a trace. Phone movement, witness observation, vehicle description, a pattern that matched the speed of events. Instead, the deeper detectives looked into the missing 5-hour gap, the more they faced a haunting reality. They did not yet understand what happened between her leaving work and her final disappearance. And a killer who understands investigations will always hide inside the gap. Digital evidence begins to matter. Phones do not lie the way people do. As days passed, investigators would inevitably shift from witness interviews to technical reconstruction. In modern cases, the phone becomes one of the most valuable artifacts because it creates a behavioral shadow. Location pings, connection to towers, app, activity contact with other numbers, movement patterns, last known, data transmissions. Even when a phone is destroyed, the network often retains partial memory. The last ping, the last signal, the last successful connection. The reason this matters is simple. If the phone location contradicts a person's claim, reality begins to break through the narrative. In cases involving manipulation, the phone becomes the enemy of the staged story. For investigators, this is where the case either progresses into clarity or becomes even more confused if the phone data is incomplete. Katie's phone had transmitted its last known location and then went silent. Wayne's awareness of the abandoned building raised suspicion, but it did not automatically explain why her phone's last activity occurred where it did. At this stage, investigators would be forced to ask deeper questions. Who had the best access to Katie's life and schedule? Who would know exactly where she would be and when? Who had the ability to control her movements without raising immediate alarm? Who had the skill to destroy evidence without leaving obvious trail? Those questions begin to shift attention away from friends and toward someone closer, toward family, toward her husband. The second suspect profile, why John Blauvelt became impossible to ignore. When a victim is a young woman and the crime involves signs of control, humiliation, concealment, and brutality, investigators often return to the person statistically most likely to have access. An intimate partner? This is not prejudice, it is criminological reality. An intimate partner has routine proximity, emotional leverage knowledge of schedules, familiarity with the victim's habits, ability to explain contact without suspicion, opportunity to isolate the victim, time to create staging. John Blauvelt, as Katie's husband, sat at the center of all those advantages, and there were additional contextual factors that would later become significant. Reports of jealousy and volatility possible, alcohol involvement, alleged controlling behavior conflicts that escalated over time, a personal history that included military experience. The critical point was not that these elements proved guilt. It was that they produced a suspect profile far more capable of executing a complex crime and shaping the aftermath. Wayne may have looked suspicious, but John looked capable, and capability matters when the crime is designed to confuse. How investigators can accidentally destroy their own case. At this stage, law enforcement faced an internal risk. If they pushed Wayne too hard too early, they could trap themselves. A premature confession, especially one later proven false, does not simply harm the wrong person. It poisons the entire case. Because once the public and the system hear confession, resources shift away. Pressure to close increases. Alternative suspects fade. Evidence that contradicts the confession gets ignored, explained away, or treated as noise. This is why forced or false confessions are catastrophic. They do not only convict innocents, they also shield the guilty. In Katie's case, the danger was real. Investigators were on the verge of narrowing the entire case around Wayne, even as larger signs suggested the true offender might be watching them walk into the trap. The escape factor. Why the real offender benefits from investigative tunnel vision. When an offender anticipates law enforcement behavior, they can craft a strategy that relies on human predictability. Police suspect the discoverer. Police suspect the ex-partner. Police suspect the weird person. Police suspect whoever looks unstable. Police chase the most immediate story. Meanwhile, the offender uses time to clean, hide, and leave. The most disturbing element in this case is not only that Katie was murdered, but that investigators believed the true offender may have continued moving forward with a new life, while the wrong suspect sat inside an interrogation room. The longer Wayne remained the focus, the more likely John could separate himself from the original timeline, relocate, detach, and transform into someone harder to trace. A nearly perfect crime does not require magic. It requires time, and a story investigators will believe. The case crosses a threshold from who did it to how was reality rewritten. As the interrogation continued, the investigation began to stand at a fork. One path led to a fast conclusion. Wayne confesses, case closes, narrative becomes permanent. The other path led to a dangerous truth. The crime scene was manipulation, and the killer was closer than expected. A documentary analysis must acknowledge the most important shift here. This was no longer only a case of homicide. It was a case of narrative engineering. The offender did not simply kill a person. He attempted to control what the world would believe afterward. And that type of crime leaves behind a different form of evidence. Not always fingerprints or DNA, but patterns of deception, strategic misdirection, and the psychological shape of a trap. The next phase of the case would depend on whether investigators could recognize that trap before they destroyed their own ability to escape it. Because once an investigation commits too strongly to a theory, it becomes blind to the truth standing right outside the frame. Digital shadows and the vanishing suspect, when the case starts pointing away from the obvious answer. The investigation's second phase, when emotion fades and data takes control. After the initial shock of discovering Katie Blauvelt's body, the investigation inevitably entered a colder, more methodical phase. Early homicide work is often reactive, driven by urgency, fear of public danger, and the raw emotional gravity of a young victim found in a horrifying scene. But as hours turn into days, emotion alone can no longer support the case. At that point, investigators have to switch into reconstruction. Reconstruction is where the narrative becomes measurable. It turns witness statements into timelines, cell phone activity into movement patterns, relationships into motive networks, and crime scene details into behavioral signatures. Unlike eyewitness memory, reconstruction is less vulnerable to emotion because it relies on systems that record time without preference. And in Katie's case, reconstruction carried a dangerous implication. The more the evidence became quantifiable, the less convincing the staged storyline appeared. This phase is critical because staged crimes are built to survive the first hours. They are designed to manipulate first impressions, but they rarely survive the pressure of technical verification because technology records what manipulation cannot fully erase. The 5-hour gap, the most valuable territory for a killer. The disappearance timeline contained one feature that haunted investigators from the start: a significant missing period between Katie's last confirmed contact and the moment she was reported missing. This gap was not a trivial detail, it was the crime's most important asset. In homicide cases, the gap is where the offender acts. It is where the victim is moved, where control is established, where evidence is destroyed, and where the killer builds distance from the act.